Ladies, gentlemen, come on in. Have a seat at the bar or find a comfortable spot in a booth. Order up a beverage. Relax. You are about to experience the best entertainment Disney has to offer. For you're in my place. Welcome to the Mouse Lounge.
To all who come to this happy place, welcome. Here age relives fond memories of the past. And here youth may savor the challenge and promise of the future.
The new season of the Mouse Lounge begins featuring the creative team behind the Silly Symphonies Collection. All 75 Silly Symphonies made between 1929 and 1939 on 16 exquisitely produced vinyl records, plus a free digital download, all lovingly restored by producer and the audio genius behind A Musical History of Disneyland, Randy Thornton. In this, the third of a three-part podcast, we introduce you to prolific author and Disney historian JB Kaufman, who spent over an hour with me just talking about the Silly Symphonies. The Silly Symphonies Collection is now available for pre-order at SillySymphonyCollection.com. Check it out. Oh, and by the way, if you weren't there for D23 this year, be sure to download Paul Berry's A Window to the Magic show number 485, featuring the Silly Symphonies live on stage. It has fast become my favorite WTTM episode. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy a conversation with JB Kaufman about the Silly Symphonies. The pressing question that pops into my mind first and foremost about the Silly Symphonies is on the heels of Gallopin' Gaucho, Plain Crazy, and then the first Disney sound cartoon, Steamboat Willie. Clearly, with Pat Power's help, Walt had success with Mickey Mouse. What was the impetus for starting the Silly Symphonies in the first place?
Well, actually, the original suggestion seems to have come from Carl Stalling. And you may have heard this story, but when Walt was on his way to New York to record the soundtrack, first of all to find a sound system, and then to record the soundtrack for Steamboat Willie, he stopped off in Kansas City to see Stalling and dropped off prints of the first two Mickey Mouse cartoons, which were silent, and asked Stalling to come up with scores for them and talk to him about his plans for the immediate future and making sound cartoons. And Stalling apparently at that time suggested the idea of a musical novelty, combining music with animation, which isn't necessarily an obvious thing to us in hindsight, but at the time, it really was a novelty. And Stalling had an idea that cartoons could be combined with the rhythm of music to a really engaging effect, and he even suggested, according to Walt's letters, the subject for the first one, which was dancing skeletons.
The skeleton dance was completely composed by Carl Stalling, as I understand it.
Well, it incorporates the March of the Dwarfs by Grieg, but the overall score was composed by Stalling with that interpolated quote. I think it's important to keep in mind that Stalling had a real following as a theater organist in Kansas City. He had extensive experience in playing for silent films, and that was part of the repertoire of a silent film organist. They had to have any number of classical themes at their fingertips, literally, to accompany all kinds of moods in films that were being shown at the theater. And very often they were improvising as they saw the film for the first time with an audience in the theater. So they had to be really conversant in all of these classical themes, and Stalling had a real library of those themes in his mind and could draw on them instantly for any purpose. So it was no problem for him to come up with something from the common literature of music, as well as to come up with original themes of his own.
Thematic devices from classical music, plus, as I understand it, he had a encyclopedic knowledge of popular music, which he would carry forward into his work at Warner Brothers, did he not?
Exactly, and in fact, that was one of the big dividing lines, because at the Disney studio, he had to be very careful about that, because anytime that that was one of the great attractions of classical music, of using classical music, is that it was mostly in the public domain, whereas current popular music generally was owned by someone and required payment of royalties. So when Stalling went to Warner Brothers, part of their mandate, part of the cartoon studio's mandate at Warner Brothers, was to plug songs that were in the catalogs of the various Warner's music publishing houses. So the Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies were undertaken partly as a way of promoting Warner Brothers music publishing interests. So yeah, he especially was encouraged to use any number of those themes, and he came up with a, as you say, a pretty amazing variety of them.
Let's go back to the Skeleton Dance. He incorporated the Edvard Grieg, and that was the March of the Trolls. And there was another Dance Macabre. Was that the other classical piece that he integrated?
That's the rumor. In fact, he actually came up with an original theme of his own that was very similar to that.
The Skeleton Dance was fully animated by Ub Iwerks, was it not?
Yeah, well, pretty much, yes. He had people working with him as in-betweening and cleaning up his drawings. But for the most part, he animated every scene. We know that the scene of the rooster crowing toward the end was animated by Wilfred Jackson. And Les Clark claimed to have done some of the characters in the opening scenes, but almost all of the animation was the work of Iwerks, considered one of the best animators in the business in the 1920s, and that was a big part of his stock in trade. The fact that cartoon characters could do things that were impossible for human beings. So yeah, rubber hose animation was a relatively easy way to exploit that. And yeah, a character could bend out of shape and then snap back into shape. And it wasn't until later that the animators started studying animal anatomy and paying more attention to volume and weight and so on in their animation. At this point, rubber hose animation was kind of the leading practice, and it did make it possible to picture all kinds of delightful, fantastic things.
Which for an audience in 1929 or 1930 would have been completely new. We've gotten a little bit jaded in our advanced viewings and all of the draftsmanship that has evolved over the last 90 years.
Well, we have, although I have to say that I really love those early cartoons. It's a funny thing. One of the spectacular things about the Silly Symphonies is that the series lasted barely a decade, but it encompassed such a tremendous flowering of technique that depending on what part of that decade you look in on, you're seeing vastly different kinds of art, and I love the way that the films evolved. But I don't. This is one of my soapboxes. I don't want to ever give the impression that the earlier films were inferior in any way. I say that they were just different. It was a different style, and in its way, it's a really delightful style.
Truly, and evolutionary, because over the course of that decade, you can see how they are trying new techniques, not just in draftsmanship, but new techniques in terms of the technology and how it evolved, introducing the multiplane camera and so forth. And we'll get to that.
Exactly, yeah. The technology, the storytelling, everything about it. In fact, the Disney studio very kindly provided us with a beautiful illustration of the changes by making two different versions of the Ugly Duckling. There was one that was made in 1931, and another one made in 1938, although it wasn't actually released until 39. And it's amazing to put the two films side by side, because they are so vastly different from each other, and they absolutely do illustrate the differences in technique that had come about by the end of the 30s. But again, I don't want that to suggest that the earlier version is inferior in any way. It's a thoroughly charming and enjoyable cartoon, just made in a very different style.
Who were the cast of characters that actually made these films, and can we in any way tie them into what we now refer to as the Nine Old Men? Was this a testing bed over the course of that decade for their graduation into the big leagues of feature films?
Well, it's through hindsight, it's very often seen that way, and I think that Walt liked to frame it that way when he was introducing the films on television. At the beginning of the series, of course, he had a lot of foresight, but I didn't think that he imagined he would be making feature-length films a decade later. So yeah, they did serve as a testing ground, even if they weren't necessarily planned that way. As far as the cast of characters is concerned, I tend to focus a lot of my attention on the 1930s, and my standard line is that at the time that I'm looking at, the Nine Old Men were still the Nine Young Whippersnappers, and the people who actually created the sort of aesthetic that we think of today as Disney animation were the giants like Fred Moore and Bill Teitla and Norm Ferguson. And this is not to take anything away from the Nine Old Men, but I think that earlier generation deserve a tremendous amount of respect and admiration. And when the artists that we now know as the Nine Old Men were just coming in, they were assisting the old masters and learning from them, and then they went on to follow their own paths later on. So you actually get, you were asking about tying it in with the Nine Old Men, and in fact, you do see most of those individual talents starting to emerge. Now let me back that up a little bit. Les Clark was there from the beginning, and he was one of the Nine Old Men. But when we talk about that group, we tend to think of the kind of celebrity artists, Frank and Ollie and so on, and you can see them coming in around the mid-30s. Ward Kimball is another one. You can see them coming in and starting as assistants to the established animators, and by the end of the 1930s, they're just itching to get their hands on full animation. And in the course of the late symphonies and the early features, they begin to graduate into that class.
When I see a title card on the screen and it's a Warner Brothers cartoon and I see that it reads Charles M. Jones, I know that it's going to be the burgeoning days of a supervising animator, and it's a far cry from the Bugs Bunny cartoons that we would see 15, 20 years later with his inimitable style. With Freddie Moore, what was his stock in trade, his major asset as far as his animation style?
The interesting thing about Moore, well, there are a lot of interesting things about Fred Moore, but one of them is that his talent was instinctive. He was sort of the polar opposite of someone like Ham Lusk, who was a very skillful artist, but it didn't come easily to him. He had to really, really work at it. People testified that he would just sweat and strain and agonize over a scene until he got it exactly the way he wanted it. With Moore, it was instinctive. The art just seemed to flow out of his pencil, and he was he tends to get pigeonholed in terms of cute characters. The cute label gets applied to his work quite a bit. I think that's kind of oversimplifying, but there is an undeniable appeal about his characters, and it just seems to just naturally appear on the screen. He's just, it's a gift, and it just it flows out of him seemingly effortlessly. How that compares between his earlier work and his work on something like Snow White, I think basically that you just see his style ripening all through the 1930s, so that by the time of Snow White, he has really just come into the kind of the fullness of his talent, and it's such a reliable asset. It's like a pitcher's arm, a really great pitcher. You can always rely on him to deliver. Walt it's clear that Walt felt that way about Fred Moore. And in fact, I just finished doing a whole lot of research on the film Pinocchio, and I don't want to wander too far off the subject here, but I think it's interesting that the story team started out by trying to adapt the character of Pinocchio as he was in the book, which was frankly a pretty obnoxious character. And it's clear from some of Walt's comments that he was relying on just the inherent appeal of Moore's drawings and his animation to make the character palatable, even though he had that obnoxious personality. In the end, that turned out not to be enough, but it's an indication of just how much Walt was ready to rely on that infallible talent that Moore had.
Jesse and I were talking as we were setting all of this up about the effects animation, and we were both remarking to each other how dramatic the evolution of animation was in such a short period of time. When you've got the Silly Symphonies as a test bed for the future features, what would you say is the critical keystone evolutionary patterns that were created in the Silly Symphonies from where they started in 1929, 1930 versus when they ended in 1938 that allowed them to transition into feature films?
1935 is a pretty key transitional year because they reached a point in 1934 that was really, they were really they were the darlings of the box office and the intellectuals. There was just this wonderful feeling of mastery that they had accomplished by 1934. When you're looking at Tortoise and the Hare and Grasshopper and the Ants and The Flying Mouse and so on. I think that a lot of audiences would have been perfectly happy to just see them stay at that point forever. But it's clear that Walt was never fully satisfied with anything for very long during those years, and so it's fine to be able to do those films, but he wants more. And in fact, we know that it's the most famous example in their development of animating the human figure is the Goddess of Spring. Persephone in the Goddess of Spring must have really caused Walt's heart to sink, because she clearly was not a character who could have carried an entire feature-length story the way Snow White had to do. And so I think 35 is the year where you really see him just reaching farther and farther and farther for new effects that haven't been achieved before. And that is where, for example, the effects animation department really starts to come into its own. And sure enough, 35 also becomes the year when they shift into high gear on Snow White, and the actual full animation for Snow White begins in 36. So I would say that 1935 was the year when they really turned the corner, and they reached a peak of brilliance in some of the films like Musicland, for example. I'm always floored by the fact that Walt didn't like Musicland. And we know he didn't because he said so in a memo. This isn't a rumor. This is something that we have in writing.
I did not know that. I'm stunned because of all 75 cartoons, that would be my favorite.
Well, I don't think I could pick out one favorite, but that would certainly be among my top 4 or 5 anyway. It's such a brilliant cartoon in so many ways. And in fact, when Russell Merritt and I were working on our Silly Symphony book, we talked to Frank and Ollie about that, and they had an explanation of their own. But yeah, it is mind-boggling to me that Walt didn't like it. But it is so brilliant in so many ways, and one of them is the effects animation. If you watch the film with just the effects in mind, they are pretty remarkable. And you can, if you really stop and study each scene, it's amazing to see, the follow through of all the waves and the foam and everything, and all of those when the musical war gets started and they're blasting musical notes back and forth. Somebody had to animate all of those notes.
Yeah. I was absolutely floored when I first saw the animation of the pipes, and I later revisited the cartoon many years later after computer animation had become much more in vogue, and I realized that the rigid animation of the pipes of the pipe organ when they come into place to fire at the opposing side is so precise. And today they wouldn't think twice about it. They would immediately relegate that to a computer algorithm to do the exact same job. But this was all done by hand with great care.
It is. It is just. It's just mind-boggling. I think we're using that word a lot, but it is justified.
It's completely appropriate. Go ahead.
Excuse me. Well, I was going to say another remarkable silly symphony of 1935 is Three Orphan Kittens, which of course won the Academy Award for that year. And you see more of that kind of thing there, where the camera appears to be moving through a room, and you're seeing the furniture and everything moving in perspective, the floorboards and everything. Somebody had to do that and do it without a noticeable jitter on the screen, and it's done so beautifully that it really simulates the effect of a tracking shot moving through the room,
where all of the perspective has to be absolutely right, and the character animation is in the forefront, so it's almost as though it wouldn't be noticed, that background animation, unless it was wrong. But they got it so right that we don't really fixate on that. We're watching these kittens and the characters they're evoking from the screen.
Exactly. It's one of those jobs that is measured by whether or not it remains invisible. Once you start to notice it, then something is wrong.
Yeah, and
as you say.
And geeks like us, for lack of a better word, we would almost like to see the cells of the characters removed just so that we can see how that animation in the background is moving, how these tracking shots worked. And they had to be so precise from frame to frame to frame. And back in those days, were they animating at 12 frames a second and exposing the picture twice, or were they animating at 24 frames per second? 24 cells.
It varies, case by case. But when it came to something like that, I'm pretty sure that would have been there would have been a new drawing for each frame, just because they had to maintain that smoothness,
that illusion.
So yeah, there's no hard and fast rule about that. There were cases where a single key drawing would be held for several frames, but in the case of something like that where the animation has to be smooth and where you won't be noticing any noticeable jumps, that would have to be there would have to be a new drawing for each frame.
Let's move to the music a bit. We were talking about Musicland, and another of my favorite Silly Symphony cartoons based upon the soundtrack alone, which the Silly Symphonies collection that's forthcoming is going to really bring out the fidelity, finally, in a manner that has never been heard before. But that's Woodland Cafe.
Yeah, that's a great little cartoon.
If you look at the totality of the work that was done in that decade, how did the music evolve?
Well, there again, it was in gradual steps. As you probably know, they were using Pat Power's proprietary system, Power Cinephone, when they started. And aside from the fact that this was a pirate system, meaning it was of dubious legality because he infringed on other people's patents, it also ultimately wasn't a very good sound system. It was available to Walt at the time, and not many other systems were. So he used what he could, but the fact was that it had some real technical limitations. And as soon as he was able to work out his contract with Powers and go to the much more technologically sound system, no pun intended, that RCA had developed, they jumped on that process. So by the end of 1932, they're recording on the RCA system instead, and it's a great improvement. And yeah, you're right. The early soundtracks were all recorded in one take, but so then as the 1930s progress, especially when they get into the RCA system, they are able to break that down so that they can start recording the orchestra separately from recording the soundtracks and the voices, and then mix all the tracks together in the final composite track. So there are all of these kind of incremental developments happening all the way through the 1930s, and you can really see the effect of it in a film like Woodland Cafe, which it makes so much of the various musical components that went into it. One of the interesting things I think about the music is that they're moving more and more into a very, very lush style, both visually and musically. And you could argue that reaches kind of an apex in Pinocchio. But you can really see it coming in films like The Old Mill, and Wink and Blink and a Nod. And Russell and I have been calling that kind of the Rembrandt look. They really went in for just more and more luxurious, rich, layered tones in painting the backgrounds, in modeling the characters, and you hear it on the soundtrack too. One of the things that I've always thought is interesting, and we were talking a while ago about the need to pay royalties for published music. Because of that, very early in the 1930s, Walt started to steer away from using any established music. So there are cases, for example, in The Tortoise and the Hare, when the hare is playing baseball with himself to show off how fast he is. Harleen was asked to write a piece of music that wasn't "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," but sounded like it. And sure enough, when you watch that sequence, the hare playing baseball with himself, you could swear you're listening to "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" until you stop and listen to the melody and realize it's not exactly the same thing. So it's an original thing. Now, as the 30s wore on, there would occasionally be exceptions to that, and I think one of my favorite exceptions is in Woodland Cafe, because the song "Truckin'" had been a really popular hit for Fats Waller about 2 years before that. Sure enough, there it is in the soundtrack of Woodland Cafe, and it's a great performance of it. It's a really, this is jive. This is really the current style of music, and they're doing it very, very well.
That actually will allow for I think, a fair tangent, and that's to touch upon, if not ponder endlessly about, the product of the era from which these cartoons come. And there's clear examples, if not blatant racism, certainly a lack of sensitivity to racial stereotyping. Touch upon that for a bit, and what would you recommend for a modern audiences who've never seen these cartoons before, their mindset going in when they go to view them?
Well, in all of these films, and in fact in all classic films of all periods, I think that it's really, really important to try to see the films in the context of the time when they were made. Now, of course, the best of them transcend that context, but it is the case that that audiences in the 1930s were sensitive to very different things from those that the culture has tended to focus on today. So there are any number of references which I think at the time would not have been necessarily taken as insults. You know, this is going to sound like those little introductions that Leonard Maltin has to do on some of the
Whoopi Goldberg in the Warner Brothers domain.
Yeah. But it is the case that that if you look at the cartoons from any, and I don't mean to excuse anybody for anything, but for me, the fact that you refer to race is one thing. If you do it, to me, it's and I may be treading on thin ice here, but to me, it is racist if it's done in a mean-spirited way. If it is intended to insult or to diminish or to be purposely insensitive, I think you can tell when a gag is being offered in a spirit of friendliness or cheerfulness, or when it is intended to be harmless. And I don't want to make any excuses for anybody, but I think that if you look at the spirit of these films, it is clear that neither Walt or anybody else in the organization intends to give offense. They're breathing the air of their own time. Yeah,
they are a product of the era from which they come.
Let's take the probably the most famous example is the peddler scene in Three Little Pigs. Mm-hmm. You and your listeners are probably aware that the original version of the scene had the wolf coming to the Practical Pig's door, disguised as a Jewish peddler with a really pronounced accent, and of course he didn't get in. So and this was the form in which the film was shown in 1933 and continued to circulate for years and years and years after that, because it was an extraordinarily popular cartoon. The first reissue of the cartoon didn't happen until 1948. Well, by that time, we had come through World War II, and societal norms had already shifted quite a bit, and without any pressure from anybody, the studio decided to replace that scene with a different one. So now, and in fact, that came in two stages. First, the animation was changed, and then the soundtrack was changed. So in the third version, which is what most of us have seen, the wolf comes to the door, and he's just kind of got a generic, old coat and a hat pulled down over his eyes, and he's saying, "I'm the fuller brush man. I'm working my way through college." So it's any ethnic import is taken out. I think it's an indication that that the artists were acting in good faith, and that it was commonly recognized that what would not have given offense in 1933 might be taken in a very different way by 1948. So, to me, this is an example of the environment that they were operating in. That as long as the early 30s were a really freewheeling time. When there was kind of equal opportunity jabs at all groups in all films, and so and nobody ever thought twice about it. But that's those ideas have changed continually in the years since then. And I think that the studio has always tried to be sensitive to that in terms of the time that they were operating in. In later years, I was talking to one of the Disney animators about this, and he said, well, we've always kind of poked fun at everybody. He said, we've always had gags about the Irish cops and the dumb Swedes, and the Irish cops and the dumb Swedes have never objected, but some people have. So that was his take on it.
These films had several different distributors. First of all, in these early days, why didn't Walt distribute these films himself, and why didn't he, and who did? Because I know he went through several.
You had to be part of a larger organization. At the time that Walt started producing Mickey Mouse and Silly Symphonies, he didn't have a volume of films that would qualify him to distribute them on his own. Let's put that in terms of the Disney brothers, because they were both at the head of the company. But they needed to have a volume of product that would qualify them as a distributor, and at that point they didn't have that. Now, at the time, the norm was for a cartoon studio to be under contract to a major studio, and hence the Warner Brothers cartoons. The Fleischer studio was they were mostly distributed by Paramount Pictures and so on. Because Walt elected to remain independent and not be controlled by another company. That was one of the lessons he learned from losing Oswald the Rabbit. He was determined to maintain his independence and not be taken advantage of that way again. That meant that he was essentially operating as an independent producer, and an independent producer had two options. He could either distribute his films on what was called the states' rights system, where people would buy the rights to show the films in a particular territory somewhere in the country, or he could contract with a major studio to distribute the films. And in fact, the Mickey Mouse series at that point was distributed by Powers on the states' rights system, which was one reason why it took so long for people to discover Steamboat Willie. It opened in November of 1928, and there were some parts of the country that were only getting their first look at it a year later. So, it was a real kind of haphazard system. Now, from the beginning, the Silly Symphonies were distributed by Columbia Pictures, which was not the most prestigious studio in the business, but it did have the advantage of a national distribution chain. And so that was the company that started off distributing the Silly Symphonies. They carried on into 1932, but the Disney brothers were not entirely happy with all of their practices, and they seemed there were times when their returns, financial returns from Columbia seemed to be suspiciously low. So by the time they finished their current contract in 1932, the Disney name was becoming much better known. The Silly Symphonies were being regarded as something really special. They had attracted a lot of national attention. And so they were able to trade up to United Artists, which was not actually a studio. It was strictly a releasing organization. But it was it had more prestige in the business than Columbia had. So beginning in early 1932, they were distributed by United Artists, and that went on for a while. And in the meantime, the Disney cartoons were continuing to attract more and more favorable critical attention. They were becoming the real gold standard of animated cartoons, and so it was by the mid-30s. Roy Disney found that he was in a position to consider offers from most of the major studios for the Disney contract. There was enough demand for Mickey Mouse and the Silly Symphonies that they didn't necessarily have to accept anyone's terms. There was always somebody who was willing to compete with better terms. So in the early months of 1936, they went from United Artists. They contracted with RKO Radio instead. And again, it took a while to work out the United Artists contract. But by about the same time the following year, 1937, RKO had taken over the distribution of the Disney films. And there again, Roy, this was during the period of the studio's real strength, and they had become, by any standard, the ultimate animation studio. There was real competition for their films. So RKO continued to distribute the Disney product, but it wasn't a foregone conclusion. They still had to compete, and they still had to offer the very best terms that they could come up with. So by the end of the series, by the end of the Silly Symphonies, RKO was the distributor of record, and in fact, as it turned out, they distributed almost all of the Disney films to theaters through the 1940s and into the early 50s. And at that point, the Disney studio had produced so many features that they actually could establish their own distribution network, and that's where Buena Vista Pictures came from. And at that point, in the early 1950s, the Disney operation did become more self-contained, and they did distribute their own films. But it took all of that time, building up all of that momentum and that backlog of films, before they really could justify opening their own distribution offices around the country and around the world.
And it all started with the Silly Symphonies, and it would later evolve in other areas of their business when they start becoming their own self-contained live-action studio, and then they start distributing their own films. Wonderland Music and Disneyland Records evolved out of that, all happening in the 50s, well after the Silly Symphonies had finished their run. You had touched on marketing a bit earlier, and I wanted to talk about that ever so briefly. At that time, Kay Kamen would have been the merchandising guru. How did the Silly Symphonies cross-pollinate into from the films to marketing? What kind of products were released, and how did that lend profitability to the company?
Well, it's of course the king of Disney merchandising in the 1930s was Mickey Mouse. He was such a fabulously popular character that they could always rely on the popularity of Mickey Mouse merchandise. But at that time, there wasn't. I don't want to encourage the idea that there was too much of a line of demarcation between the Mickeys and the symphonies, but in general, you might say that the Mickeys were sort of the bread and butter of the studio, whereas the symphonies were kind of the real, as Russell Merritt says, the Tiffany line. They were the absolute prestige product of the studio. That doesn't necessarily mean that they lent themselves as well to merchandising, because they as a rule introduced new characters with each film, and you don't build up much of a continuity that way. But I think the breakthrough for the symphonies in that department was Three Little Pigs, which again was, by any standard, probably the most successful one-reel cartoon ever made by any studio. And at that point, they were able to establish a really successful product line of Three Little Pigs and Big Bad Wolf merchandise. And from that point, and because that film was a real breakthrough in personality animation, you started to see strong personalities in some of the later films. So for example, Dirty Bill in The Robber Kitten became a popular character. Actually, I'm overlooking kind of the most obvious example here, and that is that a character who was intended to be just a one-shot character in one of the Silly Symphonies was Donald Duck. And, of course, he was such a recognizable personality and caught on so well that, of course, he did become a continuing character. And there was a lot of Donald Duck merchandise, too. But that started in the symphonies.
Didn't Pluto become a character through the Silly Symphonies as well?
Well, he's an interesting case. He actually evolves in the Mickey Mouse films in the early 30s. But then he did star in a Silly Symphony in 1932, and it's interesting to look at the publicity for it, and even in the copyright synopsis, which wasn't intended to be seen by anyone but the staff at the Copyright Office. It's the thinking seems to be that he's a familiar character from the Mickey Mouse series, but you can't really call this a Mickey Mouse cartoon because Mickey isn't in it. Therefore, we'll call it a Silly Symphony, and because Pluto is known in connection with Mickey, we won't call him Pluto in this. We'll just call him a dog. So there's kind of a roundabout logic there. But yeah, he actually was the star of this cartoon. It was called Just Dogs, and it was released in 1932. And then years later, in 1936, he appeared again as the star of a Silly Symphony called Mother Pluto, which again, by that time they did call him by name. There was no denying the fact that he was the character. But again, it was planned as a Mickey cartoon, and then when Mickey was cut out of it, they felt a little awkward calling it a Mickey Mouse cartoon, so it became part of the Silly Symphony series instead.
Keeping with the thematic device of the distribution that we had talked about a few minutes ago, wasn't there a distribution agreement with one of the distributors that they had to put Mickey Mouse somewhere in the title card or they wouldn't release the Silly Symphonies at all?
I don't think it was an ultimatum, but it was. Yeah, that's one of the stories that you hear a lot, and it didn't happen at the very beginning. But by the time that they moved to United Artists in 1932, as I said, I don't think it was an ultimatum, but I think it made everybody happier to say Mickey Mouse presents a Walt Disney Silly Symphony. So yeah, if you look at the United Artists releases. That's what the title card will say. Mickey Mouse presents a Walt Disney Silly Symphony. And in fact, here's a little teaser for you. Mickey actually can be glimpsed in 2 of the Silly Symphonies.
Oh, which ones?
Yeah. Well, in one of them, it's actually pretty easy to see him. But in fact, the 2 that I have in mind are the 2 that were designed as Christmas releases featuring Santa Claus. In both of them, Santa had Mickey Mouse toys to deliver to the children. So the first of those was Santa's Workshop in 1932, and the second was The Night Before Christmas in 1933. And in The Night Before Christmas, it's obvious there are pull toy Mickey Mouses that come right by the camera, and you can't miss them. But actually, if you look at the earlier one, Santa's Workshop, if you look closely enough, there's a Mickey toy in that one too.
I remember seeing photographs of the Lionel handcart that had Mickey and Minnie on it from that era.
Yeah. That's another one of those great stories, which is absolutely true. I mean, it's not just an urban legend. It really did happen.
You mean the existence of the toy itself?
The existence and the difference it made to Lionel.
Right. It was the difference between profit and loss for the company back then. Right.
Yeah.
Struggling company.
They were teetering on the edge, and Mickey pulled them back.
And that licensing agreement. That's one of the things that Kay Kamen was so brilliant at. He would have so many producers of toys and stuffed animals and so forth approaching Disney to license this product, and it made the difference between profitability and the other thing.
Yeah. Both for the licensees and for the Disney studio itself. As I say, with Walt's tendency to plow all of his profits back into production, those merchandising deals had a lot to do with keeping the studio afloat during those years.
Let's talk briefly about the Old Mill, which introduced the multiplane camera. What ultimately do you think was Walt's rationale for plowing so much in the way of resources into a single reel cartoon? This was a work of art.
Well, that was part of it. Now, I do think that he was looking beyond that to Snow White, because, of course, by that time, Snow White was well underway, and it was pretty clear that the effects that could be obtained with this camera would add immeasurably to the visual appeal of Snow White as well. But the Old Mill. I think the Old Mill is a pretty fascinating cartoon. It's one of the most beautiful animated films ever made, of course, and it appears to, as everything evolved during the 1930s at the Disney studio. It's if you really look at production documents and so on, it's clear that one thing always leads to another. And it appears that the original impulse that led to the Old Mill was the idea of making a remake of Night. It's one of the earliest Silly Symphonies, and it literally is just it's at the time when they would devote a Silly Symphony to one of the seasons, like springtime or something. Mm-hmm. They actually had one that was just called Night, that showed the characters, the little swamp creatures coming out and cavorting around the water and so on, around a mill pond at night. And in fact it's a cartoon that I personally have a real affection for. I think it's really a lot of fun. But when the studio started making cartoons in color and started making new, advances technologically and so on, it wasn't at all uncommon for them to take something that they had done earlier and do a remake of it. And it appears that the idea of remaking Night was what eventually led to the film that we know as The Old Mill. And I find the evolutionary process pretty fascinating. But as it was taking shape, it's clear that Walt from the beginning wanted to make cartoons that had more going for them than just slapstick gags. Nothing wrong with a good slapstick gag, but he was very often going for pictorial effect as well, and trying to make some of the films just have with beautiful, charming visuals. And so this idea, Water Babies would be an example. It's a lot of fun, but it has some really beautiful effects behind it as well. And I think that something like that was what he had in mind when he approved production of this film that became The Old Mill. And of course, the development of the multiplane was happening at the same time, and it was just a natural thing to put the two ideas together. So that, sure enough, you wound up with this spectacular opening scene that was just, so gorgeous that it was unlike anything that people were accustomed to seeing in animated cartoons.
And, of course, became ubiquitous in the features for years.
It's important to remember. We talk about how these devices made the image more realistic, but it's important to remember that Walt wasn't really going for realism in animated cartoons. It's as a writer once pointed out at that time, it would be possible for the studio to make a film that would look convincingly like a live-action film, but what would be the point of doing that? If you do that, then you're not really making use of the medium of animation. I think that what Walt was after was a level of fantasy that was more convincing, that would draw the audience in more completely, because it was grounded in a kind of recognizable relation to reality. And the effects that you could get, the depth effects that you could get with the multiplane, had a lot to do with that. As you look at the Old Mill, you don't actually think that you're in a real, that you're looking at a real mill, that it's a live action film. But it's such a convincing image and draws you in so completely that doesn't matter. It's a thoroughly absorbing, charming experience, and it could only be done in that way.
We see echoes of the Silly Symphonies in the package films. Rhythm of the Samba, All the Cats Join In.
Sure.
Fantasia. Each segment in and of itself could be considered a spectacular masterpiece of a Silly Symphony. But those are just echoes of the past. Why did the Silly Symphonies end its run?
Well, I actually think that, we were talking a few minutes ago about the evolutionary process. I think that essentially the Silly Symphonies evolved into the feature-length films. I think that, in some ways you could see Fantasia as the ultimate Silly Symphony because, it's all through the 1930s you can feel that Walt is kind of restlessly chafing against any limitations. He's trying to get past any limitations and do new things that he wasn't able to do before. And I think that one of those limitations was the one reel format. I think that he reached a point where his ideas could not be contained in a one reel film anymore. And so I think that in phasing out the series per se and going into feature length films, he was just continuing that evolutionary process. So when you see Snow White, is in another sense, it is the ultimate Silly Symphony because it's just he's doing some of the things that he had done in the symphonies, but he's just expanded beyond that one reel limit.
One could easily project beyond Walt's lifetime that the musicals that are the modern era classics, such as The Little Mermaid and The Beauty and the Beast and so forth, evolved out of the Silly Symphonies in a way because of its integration of music and the visual art. Absolutely.
I think that I'm a real enthusiast of silent film, and I don't think it's an accident that as the silent era winds down and talking pictures start up, I don't think it's an accident that a really visionary filmmaker like Walt Disney comes up with a concept that combines visuals and music, because that really was the aesthetic of silent films. Highly polished, beautiful visuals combined with music. And sure enough, in a different sense, that's what you're getting with the Silly Symphonies. And there were at the time, I think there were just a very few filmmakers who really got that concept. René Clair in France was one, but in this country, nobody got it more immediately and more effectively than Walt Disney.
Final thoughts for anyone who has not seen the Silly Symphonies and they're coming into this genre of the one reel cartoon that's music based for the very first time.
I would say, and I say this as someone who loves classic Hollywood animation. This is not Team Spirit speaking here, because I love there are so many really talented cartoon makers who were working in American films during those years. But even acknowledging that, to me, the Silly Symphonies are the gold standard. They are the peak of creativity, of just delightful visuals, of really creative music. We haven't even talked about the original songs that came out of these cartoons, and it was that was one of the revolutionary things, the fact that a hit song could come from an animated cartoon. But it's just such an amazing experience, a kind of a jaw-dropping thing to see all of the brilliant creativity that could go into a series of animated cartoons. This became a studio that could do anything. They were you almost feel they're showing off because they can tackle any kind of subject matter and make a really enjoyable, compelling cartoon out of it. You know, if you want the really beautiful imagery, you can find it in The Old Mill and in any number of other symphonies. If you want, the sort of Warner Brothers wise-ass satiric style of comedy, you can find that in Woodland Cafe and several other things. It's just there is nothing that they can't do and do extremely well. The caricatures of movie stars, that was kind of a real subgenre of cartoons in the 1930s and 40s, and by far, I think the most brilliant example of that is a silly symphony called Mother Goose Goes Hollywood, where you see movie stars performing traditional nursery rhymes and so on. It's just a brilliant cartoon. Everything that can be done in animated cartoons is done to perfection somewhere or other in the course of the Silly Symphonies. They are just it's a level of brilliance that I don't think anyone, including the Disney studio, has ever achieved before or since. They were the forerunners of the great features, but I think that as a series they are a little miracle unto themselves.